Hey guys, today I'll show you a fantasy horror thriller TV series named Night Visions, Part 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. The first story begins with Jeremy, who is an investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board. On this particular day, he receives a notification and immediately heads to the site of a plane crash in the suburbs. Upon arrival, he and his colleagues examine the wreckage of the aircraft, noting that some bodies are still hanging from the trees, a truly horrific scene. Jeremy gathers all the necessary information and composes himself before briefing his friends in the media. The 1064 flight, which had taken off from Boston, was supposed to land at Seattle Airport at 5:45 a.m. However, at 5:28 a.m., radar and radio communications with the tower suddenly ceased. Anxious reporters quickly ask if there are any survivors. Jeremy replies that they are coordinating the investigation with all departments and will provide updates as soon as possible. Just as he's speaking, whether from stress or a trick of the mind, Jeremy suddenly sees his daughter among the crowd, only to watch her disappear just as quickly. Back home, Jeremy pours himself a drink to unwind when he hears a knock at the door. Opening it, he finds a woman who introduces herself as Marilyn. She simply says her entire family was on that flight. Realizing she is a relative of one of the victims, Jeremy invites her in. This isn't the first time he's been approached by a victim's family. Jeremy skillfully pulls out his notebook, offering comforting yet somewhat evasive reassurances. He tells Marilyn that his secretary will provide her with more detailed information about the accident. Unexpectedly, instead of breaking down, Marilyn suddenly shifts gears. She grabs Jeremy's head with both hands and tongue massages him. Jeremy gently pushes her heavy body away, explaining they had just met, and this is a bit too fast for him. Hormone-frustrated, Marilyn snaps back to her senses, bewildered by her own actions, asking herself what she was doing and how this happened. Jeremy reassures her, saying it's okay, attributing her behavior to being emotionally overwhelmed. Just then, his phone rings, interrupting the moment. It's his colleague calling to inform him that the tail section of the plane has been found at the crash site. After hanging up, Jeremy turns back to speak to Marilyn, only to find that she has fallen asleep like a snoring pig on his hormone-smelly bed. Jeremy returned to the crash site. Despite his colleague's detailed explanation of the plane's tail section, Jeremy's years of investigative experience told him that the damage inside the cabin wasn't caused by the crash itself. Instead, he believed that the plane had experienced a malfunction while in the air, leading to a series of violent shakes before it crashed. The fuselage and tail had separated mid-air. Jeremy made a call to his secretary, asking if Marilyn, who had fallen asleep at his house, had left. The more he spoke, the more agitated he became, because his secretary insisted that no one named Marilyn had visited him today. There was no record of such a person, let alone anyone who had stayed over. Jeremy yelled at his secretary, trying to prove that Marilyn had indeed visited him. Jeremy then headed to the temporary morgue near the crash site. As he looked at the neatly lined bodies of the victims, he listened to the doctor explain that all 79 people on board the plane had perished. Some bodies had been found hanging from trees, making them difficult to recover. Jeremy, growing impatient, told the doctor to be quiet. A colleague quickly stepped in to calm him down. Jeremy confided in his colleague about his hallucinations and suspicions, mentioning that he felt his daughter might have been on the flight. He asked his colleague to check the passenger list. After Jeremy left, the puzzled doctor was informed by the colleague that it was impossible for Jeremy's daughter to have been on the flight, since she had passed away 2 years ago. Back at home, Marilyn showed up again, this time with a small cake, apologizing for her earlier visit. Jeremy invited her in and listened as she sat on the bed, talking about how both her children had been on that flight and were likely gone. Jeremy felt a deep empathy, as he was also starting to believe that his own daughter had been on the plane. A strange emotional connection formed between them, leading to an intimate hormone yoga session. Fantastic, but too fast. 2 minutes later, as expected, they finished their session, and Jeremy received a call from the doctor, so he returned to the morgue. The doctor had discovered a peculiar body and wanted Jeremy to take a look. Just as they were about to open the body bag, Jeremy received another call. This time, it was indeed from his daughter. She told him that she was safe and hadn't been on the flight. Hearing her familiar voice brought Jeremy immense relief, and he told her he loved her. After hanging up, the doctor unzipped the body bag, revealing a shocking twist. The doctor asked Jeremy if this was his clone because they had confirmed that this was Jeremy's body. Jeremy looked at the lifeless version of himself, and everything suddenly came back to him. This wasn't a clone or a copy. This was the real him. That morning, Jeremy had been on Flight 1064. The woman next to him had been Marilyn. Struck by her appearance and demeanor, Jeremy had instantly fallen for her, introducing himself as a government employee, though deep down he just wanted to kiss her right then and there on the plane. Perhaps due to his professional instincts, Jeremy had glanced up and noticed that the skylight above was cracked, hinting at a malfunction. He and Marilyn exchanged glances, preparing to alert the other passengers. But before they could act, the skylight shattered, and in an instant, the resulting suction pulled passengers out one by one. The plane then plummeted, killing everyone on board. It turned out that everything from the start of the story until now had been Jeremy's near-death hallucination. In his final moments, he imagined himself as the investigator, wondering what it would be like to investigate his own crash. Aside from thoughts of his daughter, all he could think about was kissing Marilyn. The second story takes place at some night when 3 students were in the school lab, dissecting the body of a man. The female student, Diane, slowly unwrapped the bandages around the man's head. The 3 of them were stunned by what they saw. Even in death, he maintained a pose with his eyes wide open and mouth puckered as if asking for a romantic kiss. But what really caught their attention was the arrow mark on his forehead. It seems like he was part of some religion. Diane suddenly remembered that this was something a priest would tattoo on particularly wicked individuals to keep them in check. The thought sent a shiver down her spine to her smelly butt. Just as they were feeling uneasy about the eerie situation, they heard a door creak open, startling them so much that they dropped their scalpels. It was their classmate, Richard, who had come back to the lab to grab something he'd forgotten. They weren't very close, so after a brief handshake and a quick greeting, Richard left. As soon as Richard was out of earshot, students Paul and Cheryl started gossiping about Richard, saying that Richard has sticky fingers. He's been known to steal the nurse's keys and even sneak into the lab to swipe drugs like morphine. After their brief gossip session, the 3 students returned to the dissection, working for another half hour before taking a 10-minute break in the hallway. During the break, Cheryl confided in Diane, revealing another secret that she and Paul have been dating for a while, and they're getting married next week. Diane congratulated them, feeling a bit envious. As emotions ran high, Paul grabbed Cheryl's hand and suggested they head back to the lab for some hormone yoga time. But when they entered the lab, they were shocked to find the body was gone. They hurriedly searched the area and soon spotted a shadowy figure in the distance. They ran towards the woods, only to find Diane there, watching the body as it beat a drum in front of it. Diane muttered that she knew this guy was evil. Terrified, Paul and Cheryl turned to run back, but in the darkness, they stumbled into a large pit. To their horror, someone tossed the body down into the pit with them. It turned out that Richard had orchestrated the whole thing, digging the pit ahead of time and manipulating the body to scare them. Paul and Cheryl quickly began to beg for mercy, saying if it's because they gossiped about him stealing keys and drugs. They promised they would never say anything like that again. As they pleaded, they saw Diane approaching with a shovel. They thought she was going to knock Richard out and save them, but instead, she coldly said they too can't keep a secret, and started shoveling dirt into the pit, burying Paul, Cheryl, and the body together. It turned out that Richard and Diane had been dating for a long time, but they had kept their relationship a secret at school, pretending not to know each other. They had been fed up with Paul and Cheryl's constant gossiping and displays of affection, so they decided to eliminate them once and for all. After returning to the dorm and taking a shower, Diane suddenly realized that she had dropped her bracelet in the pit while burying them. She needed to retrieve it in case the police investigated. Richard dismissed her concern, saying there's no way the police will find that pit. Besides, this was her plan, and he thought she planned everything perfectly. Diane was taken aback, unable to believe that this was suddenly her plan since Richard was also involved. Their relationship, already shaky, began to crumble as they started blaming each other, fearing exposure. Pretending to sleep, Diane waited until the middle of the night before sneaking back to the crime scene to retrieve her bracelet. As she was about to climb out of the pit, Richard appeared above her and delivered a heavy blow to her head with a shovel, knocking her back into the pit. Richard muttered that he told her the police wouldn't find it, but she just had to come back, revealing his long-held frustration with Diane. Apparently, their relationship had been full of arguments and distrust. Richard buried her lightly with dirt and then returned to the dorm to sleep, thinking he had won. But when Richard woke up, he found himself tied up, his hands, feet, and mouth bound, and realized he had been taken somewhere. Looking ahead, he saw Diane, who had survived the pit. It's then revealed that after Richard fell asleep, she had used a sedative to knock him out and brought him to this place. In the end, Diane finished Richard off for good. The third story begins with Tom, who is the host of a late-night radio show. One evening, he starts his shift as usual and connects with a male caller. After just a few sentences, Tom loses patience and hangs up. To him, the caller was dragging the story out too much, talking about stabbing a friend, and it just didn't sound believable. To liven up the atmosphere, Tom plays some music for his audience, creating a mood before returning to the call segment. When he answers the next call, it's the same male caller from before. Without even listening, Tom hangs up again and switches to a different line. This time, the voice on the other end belongs to a little girl named Laura, who sounds lonely and scared, home alone on a rainy night. Laura begins to explain that all her classmates went to a party and no one stayed with her. So she decided to call Tom, claiming that sometimes rainy nights can feel really creepy, and you can't help but wonder if there's someone outside your window. Just as she's talking, Laura suddenly screams in a chicken voice, and at the same time, Tom hears something crash onto the roof of his own house. A flash of lightning illuminates the room, and Tom sighs with relief, thinking it's just thunder. There's a knock at the door, so Tom pauses for a commercial break and goes to check. A pizza boy is there with a pizza, insisting it's for Tom. Tom argues he didn't order a pizza, but then, feeling hungry and noticing that the pizza was already paid for, he tips the pizza boy and takes it. Back at his desk, Tom takes a bite of the pizza and reconnects the call. To his surprise, Laura is still on the line saying, "It's so boring being alone," before suddenly exclaiming, "There's a mouse in her takeout. This is disgusting." Tom chuckles, saying, "That's some bad luck." Then, catching a glimpse of his own pizza box, he starts to worry, thinking there may be a mouse in his pizza too. Opening the box, he jumps back in horror. There really is a mouse inside. Tom quickly throws the pizza in the trash and returns to his headset. On the other end, Laura is crying in terror, shouting that someone just came into her room and turned off the lights. She saw a shadow leave, but what if they come back to kill her? They were so fast, she didn't even get a good look at them. Just hearing Laura's description gives Tom the chills down to his butt. He hangs up and tries to reassure his listeners that tonight's stories have been a bit unsettling and offers some music for a while. Suddenly, Tom hears a noise from the hallway. He opens the door and sees two muddy footprints on the floor, worrying that someone has entered his room, just like what happened to Laura. With growing suspicion, Tom heads to a small room. When he turns around, he's frozen with fear. There's a body hanging by the window. He steps out into the hallway to calm down, but then he notices the front door opening and closing by itself. Tom peers out and yells who there is. He asks the possible figure to move the car because it's blocking his door, but then he spots a plastic-wrapped corpse, causing him to scramble back to his studio in a panic. Terrified and confused, Tom sits down, puts on his headphones, and realizes Laura is still on the line. She's sobbing and pleading for his help. Tom stays silent, too scared to respond. As he spins in his chair, taking in the eerie surroundings, he thinks he's the one who really needs help. At that moment, the chair spun back to the front. Suddenly, a man was standing in front of Tom, holding a phone and taking off his jacket. He started mimicking Laura's voice, saying she felt like there's someone in the room. It dawned on Tom that this man was the pizza boy from earlier. In fact, Laura was actually this man, and he had orchestrated everything. The man then explained his motive and asked why Tom hung up on him after just a couple of sentences, and if just because his story didn't sound like a real one. He told Tom he was a murderer, but Tom didn't believe him, so he had to prove it to him. As the man spoke, Tom's eyes widened in terror. The man then shot Tom, killing him instantly. Finally, the man sat down in Tom's chair and began telling his story to the audience. So, hanging up on someone means you get killed? Looks like being a radio host is a pretty dangerous job. The fourth story begins with a real estate agent showing a young couple and their child a house. As they walked through, the agent decided to be honest, saying the reason this house is so affordable is that there was a murder here over 30 years ago. Some people are put off by that, but for what it's worth, nothing has happened to the previous tenants. The man, Miller, discussed it with his wife. He really liked the house, it was quiet, and they were just starting out in life with a limited budget. The wife reassured him that if he likes it, then she's okay with it, and it doesn't bother her at all. So they decided to rent the house. On their first night, Miller had a strange dream. In it, colorful objects like billiard balls were spinning in the air. He woke up abruptly and then heard a man shouting in the kitchen. Miller grabbed the gun from his drawer and went to check, but found nothing. He thought he heard his son crying, but when he checked, the boy was sound asleep. Convinced it was just his imagination, Miller couldn't go back to sleep, so he sat by the window. His wife noticed and came over to comfort him, using words first and muscles later. The next day, Miller busied himself with renovations, painting, and replacing the old wallpaper. As he worked, he suddenly heard the voices of the previous tenants arguing in the bedroom. Later that evening after dinner, the wife noticed that Miller seemed distant and couldn't sleep. She tried to cheer him up, suggesting they hadn't been intimate in a while and that maybe he was just stressed. They started kissing and moved to the bed, ready for some sweaty yoga session together, when Miller abruptly stopped and turned away. He thought he saw a man peeping at them out of the corner of his eye. That night, Miller had the same dream again, the spinning billiard balls in the darkness. He woke up to see a man walk into his room, open the closet, and pull out a bottle of liquor. The man drank what was left and then turned to Miller, telling him to get him some more. He then threw the bottle against the wall near Miller. After that, something changed in Miller. It was like he was possessed. When the wife came home from work, she found their son's toy car tossed in the basement. Upstairs, she ran into Miller, who was holding a bottle of liquor. He nonchalantly settled their son and began drinking. Worried, the wife reminded him he had promised her he would quit drinking after they got married, but Miller scoffed that he was just having a little because he's thirsty. The wife followed him, pressing that he had promised her. Miller grew more agitated, saying she should care more about the nightmares he had every night and that she spent so much on makeup. He told her to just mind her own business. Concerned, the wife asked if he was sick and proposed he should see a doctor. But Miller, now frenzied, grabbed her, shouting the best thing she could do for him is to shut her smelly mouth up. The wife pulled away, snapping back. Out of the corner of his eye, Miller saw the man from before lying on the bed, who urged him to do it and not to hold back. Without thinking, Miller slapped his wife hard, knocking her onto the bed. She got up, crying like a giant baby, and locked herself in the bedroom. The man reappeared, urging Miller to grab the gun and end it since women are all like this. After the man disappeared, Miller heard his son's voice, and he started to regain some clarity. He apologized to his wife, promising he wouldn't be violent again, but as he walked toward his son, he began to hallucinate once more. In this hallucination, Miller saw the man who had once lived in this very house with his family. They too had a son about the same age as Miller's, often seen playing in the same spot. This man had frequently argued with his wife and in a fit of rage had shot and killed her. This was the murder the real estate agent had mentioned that took place over 30 years ago. Suddenly, everything clicked for Miller. The man from his hallucination reappeared, now standing behind his wife, urging Miller on. When the wife proposed they should get a divorce and she would take their son and leave, Miller was furious, thinking that his wife could not just walk away with his son. Overcome with anger, Miller grabbed the gun from the drawer and shot his wife. Afterward, Miller walked over to his son to comfort him. The hallucinated man appeared again, pushing Miller further by saying that since he had started, he might as well finish it. Miller's mind connected with the man's memory. After killing his wife in that room, the man had looked at his son and then shot himself. Miller, now staring at his own son, pointed the gun at his head, ready to reenact the past. But just as he was about to pull the trigger, he noticed the colorful toy balls in his son's play car. They were the same vibrant balls from his dream. This realization snapped Miller out of his trance. The dream had been a manifestation of his deep love for his son, and the man was nothing but a figment of his imagination. In the end, Miller picked up his son's toy and began to play with it, fully aware of what had just happened. The wife, who had only been grazed by the bullet, walked over, holding her wound. She picked up their son and left the house. It seemed that Miller's love for his son had prevented a tragedy. So, the lesson learned is that renting a house with a history of violent crimes is best avoided. There might be lingering presences from the past. The fifth story begins with a scientist named Bill, who was on a flight to the desert. Perhaps it was the environment, but the desert seemed to bring back memories of his late wife, who had died unexpectedly. Upon landing, his superior officer greeted him and then took him to the site of a strange occurrence in the desert. Bill was shocked to see a massive screen-like barrier in front of him. It looked as though there were people living inside it, like a scene from a movie. The officer began to explain, "This thing has been here for 2 days now." He threw a helmet at the barrier, but it bounced off. The officer continued, saying they can see inside, but they can't get in. Bill touched the barrier and asked if the people inside could see them. The officer confirmed that they couldn't. Bill was puzzled, asking what material this barrier was made of. It seemed like some sort of electromagnetic field, and it's slightly transparent. As Bill and the officer examined the model of the area, Bill suddenly noticed that the people inside seemed to be talking. Bill suggested they should get some lip-reading experts to figure out what they're saying, but the officer informed him that this was a military investigation, and even if the barrier was a sign from God, they hadn't yet brought in lip-reading experts. The officer also warned Bill not to share any information with the CIA. While the officer was on the phone, Bill became captivated by a woman inside the barrier. Her smile, dress, and figure looked eerily similar to his deceased wife, causing his mind to wander. A young boy inside ran towards Bill, but when Bill tried to embrace him, the boy disappeared, indicating that the barrier was a boundary of their world, one they couldn't perceive. Later, Bill and the officer continued to observe through binoculars. Bill realized that inside the barrier was a family living peacefully in a suburban area. Occasionally, an old man would read Bible stories to the children. Bill thought, if they believe in God, it doesn't matter if this is a parallel universe. Their religious knowledge is at least in sync with Earth. Suddenly, the generator nearby malfunctioned, and the officer went to check on it. Bill noticed that the smoke from the generator seemed to merge with the edges of the barrier's cube. Watching the young boy inside, it seemed as though he had discovered a flaw in his own world. The boy looked up at the sky, and Bill realized that the worlds on either side of the barrier might be able to influence each other. Bill instructed the soldiers to bring welding torches, metal pipes, and a large quantity of ice. He planned to create an automatic ice launching device aimed at a specific spot on the barrier, firing a small ice cube every 3 seconds. He reasoned that if the boy could see the smoke, maybe they could break through this barrier with ice. From morning until night, the soldiers meticulously recorded all the data. Then, just before sunset, a miracle happened. Bill rushed over and saw that a few ice cubes had indeed penetrated the barrier and entered the other world. Bill tried to touch the spot where the ice had passed through, but the opening suddenly closed. After 5 days of experimentation, Bill reached a conclusion. If they continuously fired ice cubes at the same spot on the barrier for 24 hours, the barrier would open 4 times, each for exactly 15 seconds. That night, Bill watched the woman on the swing inside the barrier. She looked so much like his late wife. Considering the current state of military lockdown, there was no way to rescue the people inside. After much deliberation, Bill decided to call the CIA, reporting the situation and the ice cube data, requesting their assistance. He specifically asked for someone who could read lips to be sent over. But the next day, no one from the CIA showed up. Instead, Bill's superior found out and erupted in anger, berating him since only the military was supposed to know about this situation. The superior told Bill that he had 2 more days to figure out what this barrier was before his leaving. The following morning, Bill, staring at the data on his computer and glancing at his wristwatch, seemed to be planning something. When he heard the soldiers outside shouting that the barrier had opened again, he realized it was his chance. He was going to rush into the barrier. After all, there was nothing left for him in this world. Timing his sprint perfectly for the 15-second window, Bill made a dash and leaped through just in time, entering the world inside the barrier. As Bill stood up and looked around, it became clear that this was another 3-dimensional world. There was no desert here, only a grove of trees. The woman in the distance noticed Bill and, surprised, began running toward him. The soldiers outside gathered around the barrier, curious to see what would happen next. As Bill and the woman approached each other, he was about to take her hand and tongue massage her when something unexpected occurred. The woman suddenly turned her head and, when she turned back, her mouth had grown grotesquely large, ready to take any smelly turds. She lunged at Bill, knocking him to the ground and savagely biting into his neck. Hearing the commotion, the woman's mother and child, acting like rabid dogs, ran over and joined in the attack. The soldiers outside frantically tried to shoot, but it was useless. They couldn't penetrate the barrier, and the people inside couldn't see them. Within moments, the woman's family of 4 crouched around Bill, devouring him and his smelly part. The soldiers, desperate, continued firing to no avail. Just then, the old man from inside approached. Seeing what his family had done, he seemed to realize something had been exposed. He picked up the book he was holding, waved his hand toward the sky, and the soldiers watched in disbelief as the entire cubic barrier disappeared. The officer and superior were bewildered, thinking that the old man was a magician. With the barrier gone, the military began preparing to leave the site. The officer glanced back, feeling that something was off. Then came an unexpected twist. Inside the former barrier, the old man looked at his watch while the boy, following his instructions, used what appeared to be Bill's bones to tap on the invisible barrier at regular intervals. It seemed this method kept the barrier in its hidden state, and throughout the entire time, the old man and his family had been able to see the military's actions on the other side. It turned out that the family had always been aware of the desert environment. They could see it whenever they wanted. The information was overwhelming, and the reversal was shocking. It now appeared that the old man's family had been the hunters all along, disguised as prey to lure humans inside. They were monsters from another world, specialized in consuming humans, and their understanding of the barrier's space far exceeded that of humanity. The sixth story begins with a young man, Gerald, being extremely sensitive to sounds, often waking up in the middle of the night to the noise of police sirens outside his building. One night, after being disturbed once again, he found himself unable to fall back asleep. He made himself a cup of coffee and turned on the TV, stumbling upon a documentary about a national forest park open to the public 24/7 and incredibly peaceful. With the weekend approaching, Gerald decided to escape the city's noise and spend 2 days camping there. The next morning, he drove to the National Forest Park. The weather was perfect, and after hiking up a mountain, Gerald felt amazing, as if all his worries had vanished. That evening, he found a spot to light a campfire, enjoying the sounds of the forest while eating some peanut butter he'd brought along. The chirping of crickets was the perfect soundtrack as he drifted off to sleep in his tent. But not long after, he was jolted awake by the sound of metal clanging. Grabbing a flashlight, Gerald followed the noise and found an old man nearby, hammering stakes into the ground to secure his tent. The man's dog suddenly rushed out and started barking, startling Gerald. The old man quickly calmed the dog, and after exchanging polite greetings rather than hormones, Gerald returned to his tent. The next morning, Gerald was woken up by the sound of the old man's radio. Frustrated, he went over to talk. After a bit of awkward small talk, Gerald finally said what was on his mind, asking the old man to turn off his radio since he was very sensitive to noise. The old man obliged, turning off the radio. Emboldened, Gerald continued, saying he was here first last night and suggests the old man finding another spot since this park is huge. The old man didn't take kindly to this suggestion, asking Gerald to move somewhere else instead. Seeing the old man fiddling with a knife, Gerald decided it was best to pack up his tent and find a new spot. He moved to the lakeside to do some fishing, but to his dismay, the old man showed up there too. Whether he had followed Gerald or just happened upon the same spot by chance, it was unclear. The old man grabbed Gerald's fishing rod and told him that he's using the wrong bait and he should use a fly. Annoyed, Gerald packed up his gear and said he just wanted to be alone before leaving. That night, as Gerald was preparing to sleep, he heard the familiar sound of metal clanging again. Sure enough, it was the old man setting up his tent nearby. Frustrated, Gerald snapped, challenging him for why he kept following him. In response, the old man stood up and threw his axe, embedding it in a tree. He then muttered some threatening words. Realizing he was outmatched, Gerald retreated to his tent. The next morning, the old man approached Gerald, holding something in his arms, and told him that he woke up this morning to find that a bear must have killed his dog. Despite their previous arguments, Gerald helped the old man bury the dog. Afterward, the old man suggested they camp together since there were bears in this forest, and with his dog gone, it would be safer if they stuck together. Hearing this, Gerald suddenly exploded, releasing years of pent-up frustration. He said he just wanted a quiet weekend and there's no bear in this forest. As Gerald ranted, he pulled out a knife and killed the old man. So, in the end, it turns out he really was unhinged, taking someone's life over such a small annoyance. The seventh story begins with a psychiatrist, Michael, who's born with an incredible gift. By simply looking into a patient's eyes, he can understand their mental health issues and then absorb these conditions into himself, leaving the patient cured. But there's a price for Michael's ability. He often experiences hallucinations, which are reflections of the patient's symptoms. For example, if a patient has a habit of binge eating, Michael might find himself replaying scenes in his mind that make him feel the same way. His colleague often reminds him that he should really limit himself to 1 or 2 patients a month. If he keeps absorbing everyone's illnesses, it'll eventually lead to a mental breakdown. The only way to cope is to take frequent breaks and find a way to release what you've absorbed. Agreeing with this advice, Michael decided to take a break and drove to another city for a vacation. He sat down at a cafe with a book, hoping to relax, when a woman named Carol approached him to express her greetings, excited to know he was the exact famous psychiatrist who can absorb illnesses. Michael, sensing her politeness, replied that if she was facing a problem, just tell him. Carol then took Michael to her home and led him to her son's bedroom. Inside, her son was sitting in a corner, rocking back and forth, repeatedly muttering that he's coming from the yard. Carol explained it happened a month ago on a rainy night. She was driving with her son when suddenly a drunk man ran straight into their windshield. The moment his head hit the glass, that split second of impact terrified her son so much that he screamed. Ever since then, he hasn't been the same. After the incident, he had seen doctors, but nothing had helped. Now, her son spends his days muttering those same words and refuses to communicate. After hearing this, Michael decided to show his favor. Trusting Michael, Carol left him alone with her son. Michael crouched down to look into the boy's eyes and began the treatment, saying he could transfer all his fear of that man to him. Michael counted to 3. Suddenly, the boy stood up, ran downstairs, and called out for his mother, hugging her. Carol, seeing her son's improved state, was overjoyed. It was clear he was cured. The nanny checked on Michael and found him slightly unsteady, but otherwise okay. Michael struggled to his feet, went downstairs, and took some medicine that his colleague had given him. He explained he usually needed to take some medicine after an absorption. Carol was grateful and invited Michael to stay for dinner. That evening, as they were chatting, Carol's son suddenly stood up, sensing someone outside. He fearfully retreated to a corner, saying, "It's him, the man from the accident. He's in their yard now." Michael looked out the window and, in the darkness, saw a shadowy figure resembling a zombie. It did indeed look like the man from the accident. Michael couldn't believe the boy since he had cured him, but the knocking on the door grew louder. Carol, growing anxious, asked what they should do. Just as Michael was about to say something, the scene suddenly shifted. He jolted awake in bed. Instinctively, Michael called his colleague and said that medicine given by him didn't seem to be working anymore. His colleague responded that the medicine was fine and wondered if Michael was still on vacation. After hanging up the phone, Michael headed downstairs. A shocking and suspenseful twist awaited him. On the floor lay the lifeless bodies of the nanny, Carol, and Carol's son. Suddenly, a vision appeared behind him. The figure of the man from the accident lunged at Michael, grabbing him. Let's rewind and piece together what really happened. The visit to Carol's house and the treatment of Carol's son were real. However, everything that occurred after that was Michael's imagination. In reality, after treating Carol's son, Michael hadn't fully recovered from absorbing the boy's symptoms. He started muttering the same phrases the boy had been saying. It was clear that after years of absorbing his patient's illnesses, Michael had finally reached a breaking point and descended into madness. The most likely scenario is that Michael, in his deranged state, believed he had become the man from the accident and ended up killing Carol, his son, and the nanny. The 8th story begins with Jack and his wife, Charlotte, were at a car dealership looking to buy a car. Despite Jack's insistence that they could afford a new car, Charlotte was drawn to a red used car, saying it's only got 800 miles on it, and she felt like this car was meant for her. So they bought the used car, never expecting that it would bring a series of strange and unsettling events into their lives. That night, after bringing the car home, Charlotte felt a strange sense of sadness. She told Jack that he was a successful doctor with a great income and she was just a housewife. She didn't really feel like she had any value. Jack comforted her using his words first and muscles later. As they lay in bed, Charlotte had another thought, suggesting that they should have a fat baby because it would give them something to look forward to. The next day, as Charlotte was getting ready to go out, she adjusted the rearview mirror in the car. Suddenly, she saw a woman in the back seat mimicking her words. Maybe they should have a fat baby. When Charlotte turned around, the woman was gone. It seemed like it was just her imagination. Later that morning, Charlotte went to her friend's house to chat about parenting. When she got back in the car, she instinctively checked the back seat again, half expecting to see something. As she drove, she saw a mother pushing a stroller and felt a surge of maternal instinct. She stopped to let the woman pass and turned up the music, enjoying a brief moment of joy. But then she felt something touch her hand, making her jump. She quickly looked in the back seat but saw no one. Charlotte noticed a white bag under the passenger seat. She picked it up and emptied its contents, finding what seemed to be the previous owner's belongings: a pregnancy test, a receipt with a signature, and an address. Puzzled, she went back to her friend's house to discuss it, suspecting that the previous owner might have been a pregnant woman who had met a tragic end, and now her spirit was haunting the car. Her friend agreed that it was possible and suggested they investigate the address on the receipt. That evening, Charlotte visited the address, pretending to be a colleague of the previous owner, Melissa. She pointed to her red car and mentioned she was a friend of Melissa's. The man who answered the door, claiming to be Melissa's uncle, explained that Melissa had ended her own life in the car. As they sat and talked, the uncle described Melissa's life. She had been orphaned at a young age and had been raised mostly by her uncle. After dropping out of school, Melissa had taken up questionable work at bars, possibly turning to prostitution. Eventually, she became pregnant, fell into deep depression, and took her own life in the car. When Jack got home and saw scattered items in the stairwell, he felt puzzled. Entering the house, he found his wife dressed seductively. Before he could even ask who Melissa is on the driver's license, Charlotte seemed like a completely different person, telling him to forget about Melissa and suggesting they start thinking about having a baby. Jack felt awkward, asking what was going on today. Charlotte suddenly flew into a rage, saying that Melissa was carrying his child and she had investigated everything. Jack, taken aback, asked who Melissa was since he didn't even know her. But Charlotte didn't stop. She unleashed a barrage of insults and stormed out of the house, getting into the car and driving away. She drove for a while before it began to rain. Charlotte seemed to have another hallucination, this time imagining Melissa seducing her husband, Jack. The thought of Melissa being involved with Jack brought a wave of sorrow over her. Suddenly, the hallucination ended, and Charlotte noticed that the car windows had mysteriously closed. A strange gas began to fill the car. She tried to escape, but couldn't. Later, Jack heard the sound of the car horn and got up to check. Seeing the car had returned, he thought Charlotte might be coming back to reconcile. But when he went downstairs to greet her, he was horrified. Charlotte was inside the car, bloodied and lifeless. At that moment, the car's audio system turned on by itself, playing the same music that had been on when Jack and Charlotte first bought the car. The 9th story begins with 4 college students driving to the countryside for a vacation. Along the way, they saw a man on the side of the road asking for help. Although 2 of the students in the back seat were suspicious, thinking it wasn't safe to pick up a stranger in such a remote area, Sarah, one of the girls, laughed it off and reversed the car to pick up the hitchhiker. They hadn't driven far when they spotted a rest area and decided to stop and take a break. Everyone got out and wandered around, checking out the stalls, selling trinkets, and chatting with the vendors. But after they all used the public restroom and came back outside, they were stunned. Everyone who had been at the stalls had disappeared, and so had their car. They wondered if those people conspired to steal their car. Sarah's friend, Vicky, frantically tried to use her phone while venting to her boyfriend. Her phone was supposed to have an emergency function, but there's no signal. The hitchhiker tried to calm her down, but Vicky snapped, telling him to shut up his smelly mouth. Sarah tried the public phone, but it was also dead. Meanwhile, Sarah's brother returned to the restroom to get a drink of water. He suddenly heard a noise coming from inside. Curious, he walked to the end of the room and opened a door, only to find some pipes and bottles of liquid on the floor. Before he could react, a man in black attacked him from behind, pinning him to the ground. A group of people then crowded into the small space, forcing a liquid down his throat through the pipes. Back outside, after waiting for a few minutes, Sarah began to feel uneasy, wondering what's taking her brother so long. She called out for her brother while checking the restroom. Just then, the hitchhiker arrived and helped lift the brother's head. Sarah was confused. Was her brother dead? Suddenly, her brother's eyes flickered. He was still conscious but seemed to be poisoned. Sarah quickly laid him down. Meanwhile, Vicky and her boyfriend encountered trouble while seeking help. They flagged down a passing car, but after it drove by, it reversed back toward them. A group of men in black got out and started chasing them. In the rest area, Sarah was gently touching her brother's face when the hitchhiker suddenly started caressing Sarah's hair and sniffing it for reasons unknown. Perhaps he had fallen in love with her at first sight, but in the midst of all this chaos, the hitchhiker leaned in as if he wanted to kiss Sarah. She quickly pulled away, and the hitchhiker immediately apologized. Sarah, clearly irritated, said this wasn't the time for a hormone yoga session because they needed to find help for her brother. The hitchhiker left, heading into the woods to search for help. Suddenly, Vicky burst out from the trees, panicked and frantic, scaring Sarah. Vicky cried that a group of people chased her and her boyfriend. They've taken her boyfriend. Sarah, trying to calm her down, led her to hide in the restroom. Once inside, they realized that Sarah's brother was missing. Sarah told Vicky to wait while she went outside. She saw a car driving by, but when she returned, Vicky was also gone. Following her instincts, Sarah returned to the spot where she had found her brother earlier and discovered a hidden trap door beneath the ground. She opened it and cautiously made her way down the passage. It seemed like a cellar or a secret tunnel. Lights hung from above, leading her deeper inside. Sarah carefully navigated the tunnel until she reached a large room. Curious, she wondered if it was some kind of laboratory. Inside, she found Vicky lying paralyzed, likely poisoned, with tears streaming down her greasy face. Looking further, Sarah saw her brother already turned into a human specimen. Her breath quickened as she tried to think of what to do next, but it was too late. The hitchhiker and a group of people entered the room. It became clear that the hitchhiker and his accomplices had orchestrated everything. The vendors at the stalls earlier had all been part of their plan. There was no escape for Sarah now. The accomplices grabbed her sexy body and the hitchhiker force-fed her some liquid through a tube. Sarah was likely turned into a specimen as well. The 10th story begins with a man named Michael, who had died unexpectedly, and a memorial service was being held in the church. On stage, his wife tearfully recounted her many years of marriage to Michael, expressing deep love and sorrow. After her, their daughter Caitlin nervously took the stage, clutching a small notebook. She also shared memories of her father, recalling moments from his life. It was clear that Michael had been a dedicated husband and a responsible father, evident in the raw emotion from his wife and daughter. But then, something shocking happened. Michael's coffin began to shake. Caitlin stepped back in fear, and the relatives and friends in attendance were stunned. The coffin eventually stopped moving, and then suddenly the lid swung open. Everyone watched in amazement as Michael sat up, groggy as if waking from a deep sleep. He pried the coffin open and climbed out. While others were still in shock, Caitlin ran to him, overjoyed that her beloved father was alive again. Later, the wife took Michael to the hospital for a checkup. The doctor was vague in her explanation, suggesting that either Michael had been misdiagnosed when the death certificate was issued or that some supernatural event had occurred. She said whatever the case, Michael's vital signs were normal, and so he was truly alive again. With Michael back as the pillar of the family, they hoped to return to a normal life. But something was off about Michael. He wasn't quite the same person. At least to the wife, it seemed as though Michael had lost some of his warmth. No matter how much she hinted at wanting a more passionate life together, Michael remained cold and distant. One evening, their daughter excitedly cooked Michael's favorite dish, fried noodles, but Michael complained about the taste, saying it had a rotten flavor and that he wasn't hungry. He inexplicably lost his temper, even knocking over his meal and drink. Perhaps, having come back from the brink of death, Michael had a lot to readjust to. The wife and her daughter could only try to be as understanding as possible. That night, Michael cut out a picture of himself and pasted it onto the painting on the wall. When his daughter woke up, Michael explained to her that he had remembered something. It might sound unbelievable, but the doctor didn't make a mistake. He really did die in that accident. At the moment of death, his consciousness left his body. It felt like he was floating into a scene just like the one in this painting. Everything there was so beautiful. In religious terms, it's called heaven. After he died, he felt immense joy in that place. Now, the part he didn't understand is why his consciousness returned to this world, since anyone who reached such a place after death wouldn't want to come back. The next day, Caitlin repeated her father's story to her mother, who began to understand that Michael's return might have been against his will. It explained why he seemed so distant and lacked passion. Whether it would help or not, the wife decided to visit the church and speak with the priest about what was happening. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened at home. Michael pasted an image of Caitlin onto the painting on the wall and said he had figured it out. Caitlin was confused, but Michael smiled and replied that they should go together today. Caitlin hesitated, thinking he was joking, but Michael, still smiling, said he wasn't. Suddenly, his demeanor changed drastically. He grabbed Caitlin, intent on doing something terrible. Terrified, Caitlin managed to escape to her room. But Michael, now like a completely different person, forced the door open and dragged his daughter from the living room out onto the balcony. As he pushed her toward the edge, Michael explained the only reason he came back was because of her. His purpose in returning was to bring her with him. Caitlin, crying and confused, couldn't understand and didn't want to go. Just as Michael was about to pull her over the edge with him, the wife appeared and shouted. In that brief moment of distraction, Caitlin broke free and ran to her mother. Michael, showing no concern, simply said that at least he had tried. Then, without hesitation, he jumped off the balcony, ending his life. As he slowly descended, Michael looked up at the changing colors of the clouds and smiled, clearly longing for the other world. It was confirmed that Michael had died again. His body was taken back to the church for another memorial service. But then came a suspenseful twist. Michael's eyes suddenly opened, staring up at the painting on the church ceiling as if he might come back to life once more. The 11th story begins with 3 college students who were driving to the countryside for a vacation when their car suddenly hit a rock on the road. The car lost control and plunged off the edge of a cliff into the lake below. Luckily, as the car slowly sank, the 3 managed to swim to the surface and gather together. Despite losing the car, they were just grateful to be alive and even started playfully splashing water at each other. But then, Devin noticed something strange in front of them. Bethany and Seth turned to see what he was looking at. In front of them, inside the sinking car, were three identical figures, already lifeless. As the car fully submerged, the trio made their way to the shore where they began discussing what had just happened. Devin asked if they were dead as pieces of shit and if they were dreaming. Bethany dismissed these ideas by slapping Seth, who winced in pain, disproving the dream theory. The three started walking back to the road. Devin then asked if either of them remembered how they swam out of the car, because he didn't. Seth and Bethany exchanged uneasy glances. They couldn't remember either. It was as if their memory cut off after the car fell into the lake, and the next thing they knew, they were on the surface. Devin began to suspect that they might actually be dead as ghosts now, recalling the vision they all saw. Just then, a car approached on the road. While Seth and Bethany quickly stepped aside, Devin stood still, wanting to see if the car would pass through him. The driver swerved around Devin, cursing him for standing in the road. This reaction confirmed that they were still alive and not dreaming. Bethany tried to reassure them, suggesting that maybe it was just some miraculous force of nature that saved them. The group agreed that it was a possibility. Life resumed as usual when they returned to campus, but Devin couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. During his free time, he went to the church and confessed everything that happened at the cliff to the priest. Devin hoped that by talking about it, he could find some peace. But as he recounted the events, a strange thought crept into his mind. After telling the priest the names of Seth and Bethany, Devin suddenly sensed that something terrible might happen to them. Indeed, their souls somehow returned to the car in the lake and vanished officially. Devin, who had studied philosophy, developed a bold theory. The three of them were still alive as long as no one in the world knew they had died in the lake. Their existence was like that of three trees deep in a remote forest. If no one knew the trees existed or that they had died, then they were effectively still alive. But the moment someone discovered them, their death would be acknowledged. Realizing this, Devin was driven by a desperate need for the truth. He returned to the lake, determined to find out if they had actually died. He dove into the water, swimming down to where the accident had happened. When he reached the car, he was stunned to see the bodies of himself, Seth, and Bethany still inside. They were indeed dead. Devin decided to bring their bodies to the surface, hoping to change their fate. After a great struggle, he managed to retrieve Seth and Bethany's bodies, getting them to float to the surface. But as he tried to pull his own body from the driver's seat, a powerful whirlpool formed beneath the car. With a final effort, his body slipped out of his grasp and was sucked into the vortex along with the car. Running out of air, Devin swam back to the surface, only to find a fisherman beating the bodies with a stick. Devin shouted for him to stop, but it was too late. The fisherman flipped over Seth and Bethany's bodies, exposing their faces. Just at that moment, the real Seth and Bethany, who had just arrived at the shore, vanished instantly, their lives snuffed out as soon as their corpses were seen. When the police arrived, Devin struggled to explain what had happened, providing only a vague account of the car accident. In truth, Devin's theory had been correct. They had all died in the lake, but somehow were given a second chance at life. However, by retrieving Seth and Bethany's bodies and allowing them to be seen, he sealed their fate. So, after all that, Devin's body and the car were swept into the whirlpool and disappeared without a trace. With no one left to remember him, Devin survived in some form, while his two friends were lost forever. The 12th story begins with Mary, who had recently divorced, getting ready for bed when she noticed something strange. After dinner, she had thrown away some unwanted plates in the outside trash bin, yet somehow they were back in her house. Thinking someone might be playing a prank on her, Mary decided to call the police. 2 officers arrived shortly after. One of them asked Mary some routine questions while the other checked around the property. The police told him there was nothing they could do here. They couldn't open a case because there's no sign of anyone breaking into her home and nothing was missing. Mary protested, saying someone dangerous might be lurking around her house. The officers, possibly having dealt with similar cases too often, simply replied that if anything else happened, just call the police again. With the police gone, Mary found herself too unsettled to sleep. She put on some light makeup, applied lipstick, and headed to the bistro across the street. After ordering a glass of her favorite red wine, she couldn't shake the feeling that a creepy man at the bar was staring at her. Not wanting to invite trouble, Mary called the server, handed over her credit card, and prepared to leave. To her surprise, the server informed her that the card had expired and asked if she had another one. The man at the bar overheard the conversation and approached, offering to pay for her drink in cash. Despite his smile, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that he had ulterior motives. She quickly thanked him, grabbed her things, and left without a kiss as the down payment. As she stepped outside, she was startled to find the man following her, attempting to strike up a conversation. However, his approach was polite and subtle, not pushy. He asked if Mary lived nearby, explaining that he had just moved into the neighborhood. Although Mary responded briefly and seemed uninterested, the man bid her a friendly goodbye and walked in the direction of his home. When Mary finally got home late that night, she undressed and was about to go to bed when she noticed something odd. There was a bag in her wardrobe that didn't belong to her, and a red dress on the sofa that wasn't hers either. Then she noticed new makeup products on her vanity. Alarmed, Mary called the police again. The dispatcher, who recognized her from the earlier incident with the plates, noted that there was no evidence of a break-in or any intruder, so no officers were sent to her house. After dozing off for a bit, Mary was suddenly awakened by noises coming from the living room downstairs. She cautiously crept down the stairs and realized that someone had indeed broken into her house this time. The intruder was using her appliances and had even turned on the TV to watch some movies from Daniel C.C. Movie Channel. Frightened, Mary rushed back to her bedroom and called the police again, but just as she was describing what she had seen, she heard a door slam shut downstairs. She guessed that the intruder had fled, and, not wanting to risk another false alarm with the police, she ended the call. The next day, with nothing much to do and feeling the financial strain of her recent divorce, Mary decided to pawn her gold watch to tide her over for a while. On her way back home, she happened to run into the man from the bistro again. After some thought, she recounted the strange incidents happening at her house, saying she felt like someone was living in her house. The man, listening intently, responded with a joking question that if she had reported it to the police, or maybe she just forgot she had a roommate. With that, he walked away, leaving Mary to wonder about the unsettling events in her home. One night, just before going to bed, Mary lit a candle and prayed to God, asking not to be disturbed again. No sooner had she finished speaking than she heard the sound of a door opening. Instinctively, Mary grabbed her phone and crawled into the closet, hiding inside. Peering through the slats, she saw a shadowy figure moving about. Someone was definitely in her house. Once she heard the person leave, Mary quietly called the police. Despite her insistence that there was definitely someone in her home, the police refused to send officers. Frustrated, Mary emerged from the closet, describing what she saw to the dispatcher and pointing out that there was a suitcase in her bedroom. The dispatcher advised Mary to return to the closet and stay quiet until the police arrived. When the police finally arrived, they escorted Mary out of the closet, and then an unexpected twist occurred. Mary was bewildered when she saw a woman in a red dress standing across from her, wondering if this was the person who had been harassing her. But the woman in red looked equally confused and surprised. Without saying much, the police handcuffed Mary and escorted her out. As Mary was placed into the police car, the woman in red explained that she just bought this house from a man a week ago, but she hadn't moved in yet because she had been traveling for work, only stopping by occasionally to do her makeup. The police confirmed that the man was actually Mary's ex-husband. The woman then asked if she could get her gold watch back since it's worth a lot of money. It turned out that Mary had been living in someone else's house and calling the police on herself, all while suffering from a severe breakdown, likely triggered by the divorce. She was completely unaware of what was really going on. Just then, the man from the bistro showed up again, trying to strike up a conversation with the woman in red. He asked if her house had been broken into and mentioned that he still wanted to get to know her. The man's persistence seemed a bit off, as if he had taken some misguided advice from a self-proclaimed dating coach about being bold and dominant. The 13th story takes place on Veterans Day, when Lieutenant Dale, who had served in the Gulf War, attended the annual ceremony held in his small town. On the surface, he smiled and shook hands with the townspeople who saw him as a war hero. But deep down, Dale knew that the past 6 months had been tough. He couldn't find a job, suffered from chronic insomnia, and worst of all, he had developed severe PTSD after returning home, which often led to vivid and distressing hallucinations. After the ceremony, Dale headed to the bar for a drink and chatted with some of the locals. When one of his old buddies lit a cigarette for him, the flicker of the lighter triggered a flashback. Suddenly, Dale was back in the Kuwaiti desert, in the middle of a fierce battle with his comrades. They had walked right into an ambush, and their vehicle was hit by an artillery shell, flipping over in the dark. With limited visibility, they couldn't identify the enemy, but it was clear they were facing Iraqi patrols. Desperately, they fought back while trying to retreat, with Dale dragging a wounded comrade back to safety amidst the chaos. The intensity of the situation was something only those who had experienced war could understand. When his friend extinguished the lighter, Dale snapped back to reality, downed his drink, and headed to the restroom. However, when he came out, the smoke from a woman's cigarette at the bar transported him back to that fateful night in the desert. During the battle, Dale and his team had been overwhelmed. After a brief resistance, they were captured and taken to a secret interrogation room where Dale was subjected to brutal treatment. The enemy taunted him, loading a gun and pointing it at his head, demanding he reveal vital military information. Lost in this traumatic memory, Dale splashed water on his face and left the restroom, only to be surprised by the sight of an old comrade who saluted him. Dale instinctively returned the salute, but as they talked, he realized something was off. This wasn't real. The comrades standing before him had all been killed or died in captivity after that desert ambush. As they confronted Dale, they accused him of being responsible for their deaths and questioned him if he survived by giving up military secrets. These hallucinations were, in a way, a reflection of Dale's guilt and his unresolved trauma. Back at the bar, everyone noticed that Dale had suddenly collapsed to the ground. The townsfolk rushed over, but it was too late to call an ambulance. Dale lay motionless on the floor, a pool of blood beside him, tears streaming from his eyes. It was clear he was gone. It seemed Dale, burdened by guilt, had chosen to reunite with his fallen comrades in another world. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.